Welcome to Left in Black. My name is Sasha Panaram, and I'm a graduate student in the Department of English at Duke. And today we are joined in the studio with Professor Tao Leigh Goffe. Professor Goffe is an assistant professor at Cornell University in Africana Studies and Gender, Feminist, and Sexuality Studies. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So I want to talk today and start our conversation by talking a little bit about sort of why you're in town and what brings you to Duke. So later today you'll be participating on a panel called Caribbean Undercurrents, Visual, Sonic, and Haptic Engagements with the Sea. And that's sponsored by the Representing Migration Humanities Lab. And I want you to talk a little bit, if you can, sort of introduce yourself and what do you work on within Africana Studies and Feminist Studies more specifically. And then without giving away too much, what are you going to be chatting about tonight?
Great. Yeah, so I'm very much looking forward to the talk this evening, and it's entitled Waveforms, Remixing the Caribbean Archipelago and Albums. So really the talk is new work, but it's sort of melding the two book projects that I'm working on at the moment. So I'll be really thinking about the question of albums and album making. So if we think about photo albums as one type of album through which there's a kind of selection process of who's included and what's excluded from the album. And then on the other hand, or resonance of album, I'm looking at records, so music, and of course within the history and culture of the Caribbean, it's impossible to know it without thinking about music, the sonic, and really forming a soundtrack around that. And that's an important part of my research as well as my teaching.
That's great. Based on how you framed your introduction and what I know and have read about your work, so much of it is digging into colonial archives and really reading across these archives, which present themselves sometimes as full of erasure and full of gaps and fissures, and to go back to the word you used, tracing some of these resonances. And you have an article out called Intimate Occupations, Afterlife of the Coolie, where you trace the use of this term coolie, which also means laborer, but you trace it within the work of Patricia Powell's The Pagoda and Monique Tong's The Book of Salt. And I'd like you to talk a little bit more about that article, but also there was a line that struck me as really important to sort of the work that you're doing now. You write, "The dry, bloodless language of the colonial archive does not allow space for interiority. Fiction offers a way to queer colonial archives." And I guess I have a two-part question. You know, as you go back to these spaces, these colonial records, one's a question about method, sort of what approaches have you developed to enter into those spaces and to look at the work and pull out things that you want to present to the public and present to a reading public, a listening public, what have you. And then the other part of that is which scholars have helped you as you think about theorizing the archive as this place that you're entering into?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question because it sort of traces a journey that I've taken through the Ph.D. work and after that in terms of developing the book projects. So yes, I would say the colonial archive is important and it's my starting point, but I really have taken the sort of methodology of someone like Anne-Laura Stoller who, you know, writes about reading against that grain of that archive. And in particular, I've also been drawn to the work of Lisa Lowe on the intimacies of four continents within the Caribbean, and other scholars like Tina Kempt, who, you know, offer another approach to the archive that's much more about the body and embodiment. So for me, my career started out, I have an English undergraduate degree from Princeton, but pursued American Studies as a PhD student. And I really have begun with the literary and the novel, so literary text, but have sort of taken a turn to the sensorial because I feel that these stories require a kind of embodied way of knowing that history. So in my book project, which is entitled A History of Touches, it very much is speaking to the title of the panel today. So thinking about the visual, the sonic, the haptic, and how there's really an interplay of all of those things. And that it really is about all of these senses together and really embracing the full human sensorium, such that in my book, I begin with something that I call gastropoetics. So for me, it's not so much about the gustatory as it is about this process of digestion. And for me, in that article that you referenced, Intimate Occupations, I was really taken by what remains undigested within history, and who are those subjects that don't get included within the national narrative. So for me, that requires a radically different way of orienting a reading of that archive. So I do that through music, through looking at vernacular photography, so family photo albums, and also through looking at ghost cultures, so ancestor worship, ritual practices within the Chinese diaspora and African diaspora.
That's great. To go back to this question, who gets left out or not digested, undigested within history? So the one article you're looking at the figure of the Kuli, you have another article, I think it's 007 versus the darker races, where you shift our attention to think about the Afro-Jamaican Chinese henchmen. And I guess I want you to talk a little bit about two things, what's at stake in recovering that particular figure, and in your larger work, are there other figures that we come to encounter by way of the research that you're doing?
Yeah, thank you for drawing on that article as well, because this question of Afro-Asian intimacies is something that is definitely consistent throughout my work and is what I'll be talking about this evening. So the Chigros, these dastardly henchmen of Dr. No, the supervillain of the James Bond novel of that same name from 1958, are supposed to be they're Afro-Chinese, and they are supposed to have the intelligence of the Chinese and the vices of the black man. So this was an invention in a word all of Ian Fleming's own. And what's interesting to me about the novel is that he spends pages just kind of giving us this ethnography of these people who are black and Chinese, and he seemed to know a lot about the Jamaican Chinese community, and he probably would have met people like that having summered there during the 1950s. So it became curious to me to think about what it would mean to examine that figure, not to try to recover it in any sense, but to think about what that kind of racial mixture meant to Ian Fleming, considering that colonial policy. So in the Trinidad experiment of 1803, really the British design at the moment of Black liberation and emancipation with the Haitian Revolution, that we get this Trinidad experiment that really is predicting that the races will not mix, that they will be discrete, and they really imagine Chinese labor as coming in to form a kind of racial barrier. So that's what really fascinates me about this figure of the quote-unquote Chigro, because the Chigro is not supposed to exist. It's not supposed to be possible that there are these sexual intimacies between people of African descent and Asian descent. But if you know anything about the Caribbean, that's such a part of the legacy of the region. So this is something that has fascinated me in terms of looking at beauty pageantry and Jamaican Chinese beauty queens during this period of the 1950s as well. And yeah, it's something that I trace throughout my book.
That's great. The mention of beauty pageantry wants me to shift our conversation a little bit to think explicitly about the visual. And this piece that you had in Small Axe recently, Albums of Inclusion, which is a fantastic article, and I love the way that it opens, and I hope that you can talk a little bit about sort of your own journey writing that piece, but also what's interesting is you riff on Hortense Spillers. You take up Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, and this idea where she says that diasporic plight, results in the theft of a body for African people, for indigenous people. And your intervention here is, part of it is to think, okay, what does that mean for the Asian body then? And so then you're looking at the artworks of people like Albert Chang and Richard Fung and Tammy Orai, and really people who are working in such disparate, all working within artistic veins, but still photography, documentary, screen printings, things like that, or silk printings rather. And so talk a little bit about sort of how you came to their work and sort of even more specifically, part of what I thought was interesting was the way that the piece begins with you and your family going in search of your grandfather, your mother's father's house, I believe, in Hong Kong. Mm-hmm. And then throughout the piece itself, you have people like Chang and Feng who are talking about the mode of art that they're doing, in part as type of eulogizing for their own fathers, or it's at least in relationship to certain figures in their families. And so partly, if you could talk about all of that, that'd be great.
Yeah, I would love to delve into that question because I think even thinking back to what you mentioned about the colonial archive, it really is to do with the kind of haunting and these ghosts, but also these inheritances, and especially for people of color when we don't necessarily find ourselves within textbooks or on maps and in these certain ways. So Hortense Spiller's Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe is an incredibly formative work for my own, especially where she does talk about this theft of the body and how that changes family structures and that they become pathologized in these ways. So I really have thought about this question of a sort of sequence that she talks about of blood in terms of the mutilation of flesh, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. and what that would mean for the indentured Asian subject. Because I think it's really important to distinguish between the institution of indenture and how it's different from enslavement. Mm-hmm. And what my work does is to bring those two conversations together, because I find they're often very separate in terms of national identity or racial identity, or different disciplines, whether that's Asian American studies and African American studies. But I think the underlying issue is that of the question of freedom. And for me, it was important to pose that question, not to say that, we're just going to now map on the indentured Asian subject into this whole nexus of pornotroping, which Hortense Spiller writes about, where the body becomes flesh, but rather to think about what the contract would mean in terms of leasing that flesh, as it were. So not to be property permanently and be rendered as such, but really to be temporarily leasing yourself to another person. But of course, we know in terms of consent, it was very fraught and undetermined in terms of whether people actually sign those contracts or not. So there's that issue of volition again. But yeah, this question of flesh that Hortense Spiller draws out in that really important essay takes me to the question of the photographs and really to thinking about the history of the Caribbean Chinese as being one that's been muted and mutilated. When you think about the abuse that indentured Chinese laborers wrote about themselves within the Cuba Commission report, where they were whipped and beaten and spoke up about it and against it. So it's that sort of archival work that informs my own in terms of my family history and story. So as I'll talk about this evening, it all began with finding an old passport photograph of my grandfather. So he was born to a Black Jamaican mother and Chinese father in Kingston, Jamaica, but he was taken to Hong Kong to be raised by family there. So by his father's first wife, a Chinese woman. And my grandfather, he never really told me anything or my mother anything about his life growing up in China. And we always just wondered what it would have been for a Black boy in the 1930s growing up there. So a lot of my work is really just thinking about remapping then, like what would it mean to say that Hong Kong is a port city of the Black diaspora, or Kingston as part of the roots of the overseas Chinese. And I was lucky enough to be able to actually travel those routes a couple of years ago with my sister and with my mother. And my sister wrote an article that was published in the South China Morning Post about the experience because we had never been to Asia before. We literally knew no one there. But through what I can only call serendipity, we ended up at the house where my grandfather grew up. And there were photographs there on the mantelpiece of him, photographs that were images that we had of our ancestors. And yeah, it just really made me think about how the visual speaks, especially in terms of kinship and the objects that people choose to keep and not. So there were cousins of ours that were there, living in the house, and I kind of joked that it was as if they were expecting us, that we were in awe and we had this photographer there from the newspaper and everything, just in case someone was there, but they seemed very calm and almost to be expecting us. But the thing is, they didn't speak English, they didn't even speak Mandarin, so we really did communicate with the photographs, as well as a friend who was kind of translating for us. But to think about visual art then, I see the work of Albert Chung, of Richard Fung, and Tomi Arai as really remixing. So to come back to this question of albums and how DJing is important to my work, I see that there's a kind of poetics in the work that they're doing by forming these collages and using family photographs from the Caribbean Chinese community, in that they become like DJs, as it were, because they're hand tinting, so adding color, assorting flowers, and really like adding sound effects and different haunting echoes of this history that in many ways is not known. So I think it's a very powerful kind of work in which they create albums of inclusion for what are images like that passport photograph of my grandfather that would just be sitting in a basement in Queens and no one would know that there were all of these children who were Afro-Chinese who grew up in China.
Talk a little bit about the DJ piece. So you are practicing DJ. How did you come to that? How does that, you've talked a little bit about how it informs your research, but perhaps also how does it inform your teaching as well?
Yeah, so I began DJing, it was actually my 26th birthday. And a friend and I, we just decided that we'd always wanted to be DJs. So we just, she had inherited a controller from a friend of hers, so the equipment to DJ, and we just decided to do it. And it was the most exhilarating feeling that I'd had. So for 2 hours, we didn't really know what we were doing, but we just played songs and mixed them together and really taught ourselves. And I think it was really important, especially for us both as women, to think about what it means to DJ and what it means to kind of think about the intimacy again of a nightclub, of a dance floor, the kind of participation that's involved in that. And I do see that as akin to teaching. And I often say that, I think the best professors are DJs of sorts, in the way that, we're designing a syllabus, which I see as akin to a mixtape, if it's done properly, in the way that we're kind of blending in between genres, if you teach in an interdisciplinary form, or that we're, making an argument, which a good DJ does as well. So responding in kind to the audience, but blending between possibly different genres, but certainly different songs, and keeping this energy, sustaining this energy of the dance floor. So because of that way of seeing teaching, I began over the years, and I've been doing it for 5 years now, to encourage my students to to actually DJ themselves. So to make DJ soundtracks that are audio-visual, in which they make an argument about Caribbean literature, which I teach, and also Afro-Asian culture, which I teach classes on. So, my students have really just blown me away with what they're able to create together and making these sort of mixtapes and visual soundtracks. That does something that a traditional essay wouldn't. So they still have to write that 5-page or 10-page research paper, but there's something that's added by including this technology and the kind of haptic, visual, and sonic registers that we'll be talking about this evening.
That's great. What's next for you?
So, I am continuing research actually in the Netherlands, where I'm looking at Surinamese communities and Dutch colonial empire and Afro-Asian intimacies in that context, as well as another book project that is looking at wildlife of the Caribbean and this kind of question that I'm formulating of Afro-Asia bioengineering. So thinking about, how you mentioned Ian Fleming and these Chigros, and that they're these chimerical inventions and characters of hybrids.
We've been joined today on Left of Black with Professor Tao Leigh Goffe. Professor Goffe is an assistant professor at Cornell University. Thanks so much for chatting with me today.
Thank you.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black, culture over everything.